Okay, everybody, let's take your seats. We got to get started. We have a really amazing program for you today, and I'm not going to take up any time because there's so much that you need to hear about today. But I do want to say this has been a complete revolution in how we think about Angelman syndrome and how we think about literacy for our kids, and I hope you're going to be just as enthusiastic and excited after hearing today's seminars. A lot of us have been in the past and still are. I do want to just say one thing. There are a lot of people in this room who this summer made a literacy camp happen for a set of kids. You're going to hear something about that. It would be phenomenal if we could just give them a big round of applause because this was an incredible amount of work and it was amazing. So I will now turn it over to the superstars, and we're going to start with Erin Sheldon.
Hello. So about 3 years ago, Maggie would have been in about grade 3. My daughter Maggie has Angelman syndrome, deletion positive. And I was trying to figure out, what we were finding was that her school inclusion was sort of falling apart. Her friendships were not being as supported. When I watched in the classroom, it just seemed like she was doing something completely separate from the other kids, and we just couldn't figure out how to integrate it. And I really wanted to develop a literacy plan for Maggie. And when I went to the school and said this, the first response was really, we don't do literacy with kids like Maggie. We wouldn't even know where to start. So I put it out to the world, to all the speech therapists and everyone who I had been stalking, and I said, so who would know where to start with literacy with my Maggie? And the first name I got back was Dr. Carolyn Musselwhite. So I have been stalking this woman for 3 years, and I have now brought her to all of you. So I went to a conference called Closing the Gap, which a number of us, like Angelman moms, took it over this year. It was like our conference. It was amazing. So I went to a pre-conference workshop with Carolyn. I also was stalking Gretchen Hanser. So you'll hear both of them. Carolyn has about 35 years worth of experience working with communication and literacy with our kids who are the most complicated. None of our kids are something she has not seen before and worked with and developed the skills with. When I was at Closing the Gap, I watched Gretchen Hanser present. I actually hadn't heard of her before that point, but I heard her present, and I went, oh my gosh, she's talking about Maggie. And I went to her and I said, you did this workshop. You were talking about those kids who didn't get engaged in reading. Let me tell you about Maggie. When I try to read a book to Maggie, she gets up and leaves the room. I don't know where to start. Everybody has told me since the time she was born, good mothers read to their children. I can't read to my kid. What am I supposed to do? And when I really described her in detail to Gretchen, Gretchen said, it sounds to me like she might be deaf-blind. And I went, Helen Keller? No way, that's not my kid. I know she can see, I know she can hear. And Gretchen said, no, it's how she processes what she sees and how she processes what she hears. It sounds like she can't coordinate them together at the same time. And so when you come to Maggie and you're, hey, Maggie, da-da-da-da-da-da, she just turns her head. I mean, she just can't take that kind of feedback in her face. She can't look at you and listen to what you're saying at the same time. And Gretchen giving me that insight on Maggie, I think is insight into a lot of our kids. I don't think a huge majority, but there's a chunk of our kids, a proportion of them, who really do struggle to take in what they see and what they hear at the same time. And they're the kids who turn their heads away and resist so much of what we're doing. So that's why I then stalked her next, and why I brought her next to you. And it was just a dream come true this summer when we got to bring all of those. We brought 19 families together. I'm going to talk to you about their camp, together with Carolyn and Gretchen. And Allison Rumble, where's Allison? Allison is a special education teacher in Toronto who devoted her entire week for like 16, 18-hour days and hours and days beforehand and hours and days after to help us with the camp. Where's Cassidy? Cassidy Harm is the future Dr. Carolyn Musselwhite of Ontario. She's a university student who did the same thing, and so did Jennifer Martin, who is the speech-language pathologist who programs Proloquo to Go, the app. She had 1 week of vacation, and she gave it up for us and spent her week of vacation doing 18-hour days with our families. So that was our team. And also, actually, we had Beth Boyd, who is a special educator in Ontario, who you'll be hearing from, who's a special educator for one of our girls. A beautiful little girl named Sadie, and her teacher, Kim Smith. So we had lots of support for this camp. And what we were trying to do Let me actually progress my slide here. We had 18 people with Angelman syndrome at this camp. I had heard about these literacy and AAC camps that happen all across North America. And we had never actually heard of one of our kids getting into one of these literacy camps, where our kids are often not considered, high functioning enough to be able to get into one of these literacy camps. So we decided to do our own. We had people with Angelman between the ages of 2 to 26. We represented every genotype. We worked really hard to try to represent the entire syndrome of Angelman. We had a young girl who was speaking in sentences, and therefore most people didn't realize that she actually has Angelman. We only had 3 campers who did not travel. So almost all of our campers actually had to come from a really great distance, which meant that you can imagine we took them out of all of their routine, all of their structure, dumped them in an outdoor education center in Ontario, where it then was record cold weather, 10 degrees Celsius, and rained the entire week. So we had to stay in a very small indoor space when we had intended to be outdoors. Despite all that, we were assessing their literacy skills and how they responded to different interventions we did. We made sure when we recruited families to come that we were representing all of the mobility needs that we see in our kids, all of the motor coordination issues. So we had kids who could run on a second's notice, the opposite direction faster than you could catch them, and we had kids in wheelchairs with very significant motor planning challenges. We had kids who were using a range of communication systems and kids who weren't using any system at all. We had people who were very fluent in all their unaided communication, which is all their gestures and all the different ways that they're simply using their body to tell as much as they could. We had intentionally recruited some students with Angelman who were already diagnosed with cortical visual impairment, and we were assessing other kids who were there to see if they had that. As far as I know, my daughter Maggie is the only one who's actually diagnosed with auditory processing impairment, but we identified one more student who I think is. We wanted to make sure we had all the sensory issues we see in our kids and what we call the social approach behaviors, which are those kids who are so social that it's almost aggressive. We wanted to see how do we teach those kids, how do we engage them in literacy and in these learning things when those kids are so focused on the social interaction. And we wanted to make sure that we were representing what we see in our kids in terms of their epilepsy, because we didn't want to do anything at camp that we couldn't do at home with our own families. We grouped the kids, especially after the first day. We kind of found we had a younger group, we had an older group, and we had what we were kind of calling our puzzles in need of problem solving. And I'll talk about our puzzles again in a minute. In terms of our broad groupings, we found, here's some really important lessons, I think, for all of us. A child's motor skills, a teenager's motor skills, did not predict their literacy skills. There is no physical prerequisite for literacy. In fact, our student with the most impaired physical abilities had some of the strongest literacy skills. She couldn't show it as easily, but she had some of the strongest. Our little girl who could speak in sentences, because she actually hadn't had literacy instruction, was just as emergent as our students who didn't have a communication system. We had students who could read, who could sight word read, had memorized all kinds of words. That did not predict their writing skills. It was very clear that most of our kids, our students with Angelman, do not get any kind of writing instruction. But it's important to know that writing is when we take an idea from our head, translate it into some kind of symbolic form, and tell it to someone else. That's what using an AAC system really is. There's some really interesting research about the parallels between having an idea in your head and then having to figure out the words you know how to write, the words you know how to spell, that you can share them with someone else. That is essentially using AAC. So writing instruction for our kids with Angelman is one of the most important things we can do for them. And yet what we found was we had a really narrow range of writing skills in these 19 people that we had, or 18 people we had with Angelman, because they actually hadn't ever had any writing instruction. And that was, to me, was probably the most interesting thing, was we had the broadest range of abilities possible that I could possibly recruit all in one place. And they actually had very narrow literacy skills because our kids are not getting literacy instruction. They're not getting taught how to read. They're not getting taught how to write. They're not getting engaged in literacy stuff. And we could see that, and you're going to see lots of evidence of that. So what was the most interesting thing to me was, you know, if you want to use like the high-functioning labels, the low-functioning labels, which I despise that term, it didn't matter. That didn't matter in terms of what we need to do to move our kids forward in their literacy. We had this group of puzzles. My daughter Maggie's one of them. We only had 4 puzzles at camp. I think they were underrepresented. I think many more of our kids are bigger puzzles than I would say that the kids we had at camp. But we had really intentionally recruited kind of such a broad range of students with Angelman. And here's what we found in common with all 4 of our puzzles. They didn't have seizure control. If you are doing everything you possibly can for your child and you feel like you are putting 100% of your time into just getting seizure control for them, you are doing everything you need to do right now for literacy. The kids who really couldn't respond to the literacy instruction very well or responded very inconsistently did not have seizure control. So one of the most important things we can do for our kids is that. Maggie had just started to get seizure control back, but she was exhausted and wiped out and over-medicated. And we had 3 kids that we were actually regularly emailing and texting Dr. Ron Thiebert about and collecting video of the seizure activity we were observing in them. And so those kids were very inconsistent. We got these magical breakthrough moments, which with each one of them at some point over camp, but for the most part, their brains were so busy seizing to some level that they weren't able to respond in the same way. Our 4 puzzles also had the most significant vision issues, and by that I mean visual processing, cortical visual impairment. So cortical visual impairment is not your eye as a physical organ. Cortical visual impairment is what happens when your brain is taking information from your eye, figuring out what you're seeing, and sending the information back to your body. It's the pathways between your brain and the eye. So many of our kids, and Maggie's one of them, had had all kinds of vision assessments. And you know, we all know about exotropia, we all know about strabismus, we know about these things. But they're actually not being assessed for what they do with what they see. They're only being assessed for what their eye as a physical organ looks like. And that doesn't actually tell us very much about it. So the kids who are not responding in typical ways to our literacy instruction were actually the ones who had visual impairment. And in 2 of those kids, it had not been assessed whatsoever up until that point. In Maggie's case, after I went and met Gretchen, and Gretchen told me to have her vision and her hearing assessed and to have her processing assessed and not just her vision itself. When I went back to our eye doctor and said, you know, I met this vision expert, this literacy expert, and she says Maggie presents like she's blind. And our ophthalmologist said, yeah, she is. Could you have mentioned that a little bit earlier? What difference would it have made? Well, maybe we could have understood why she doesn't look at things. That might have helped. But the attitude of the ophthalmologist was, well, she won't wear her glasses and she's never going to learn much in the classroom anyway, so does it really make that big a difference? Yeah, it really does. So if you encounter any kind of attitudes like that as you're investigating your child's vision, find somebody else. An auditory processing impairment. I think that's much less common in our kids, but there was one other child at camp who I think clearly has, and also has, like Maggie, what he hears, how it goes in, and how he's able to act on it is very disrupted, and especially when it's combined with the vision. And there are things we can do for those kids. There are strategies we can use. The deaf-blind strategies are incredibly useful, but our teachers won't even know about them if we don't get that label applied and if we don't get those services. Know that the risk factors for cortical visual impairment are having a neurological condition, having developmental delay or intellectual disability, and having epilepsy. So are any of our kids at risk? Yeah. And it's estimated that 20% of kids with significant disabilities have cortical visual impairment. The kids who are puzzles were also the ones who had the most significant motor planning impairment. So again, this is a processing thing. This is when my brain is thinking about what I'm going to do next and has to tell my hand what to do. One of our little girls, you could see she'd be thinking, but it's like she was frozen in space, and then whomp, she'd have one really quick sudden movement. That's called apraxia. That is, what we found was that kind of physical impairment did not correlate with what she understood about literacy. She appeared to be one of our lowest functioning, but there was no correlation between her physical impairment. She simply couldn't show what she knows. She had a physical disability there that was really making it difficult for her to demonstrate what she cognitively was understanding. So no matter what is going on physically with a child and what they look like and how they act, we need to presume that literacy instruction is absolutely essential. What do our kids need? What we found from camp, and I think what we really knew going in, but this really confirmed it, was our kids need, our sons and daughters need access to the support they need to be able to use technology, materials like books, and to have access to the vocabulary so that they can use a communication system, so that they can develop their writing skills, and they can develop what's called phonemic awareness. Phonemic awareness is when you're really able to understand the sounds of language. So for example, phonemic awareness is when I can hear Maggie, Mama, Maisie, and I know they start with the same sound. It's when I can, I start developing phonetic awareness when I know that Maggie, Mama, and Maisie start with the letter M. Right? When we have that kind of knowledge about words, about the sounds I hear, and that those sounds can be represented by letters, I can actually now start communicating things. And you will see that in a lot of our kids already, who they have a sign, and it's the letter M, and it's by their chin, and it's for their friend Maisie, right? That kind of thing. Our kids, if all they develop is that ability to identify that first letter and tell you that they're thirsty and they want something that starts with a C, wouldn't that by itself be absolutely revolutionary? If that's the only thing we're able to do, then we have rocked their worlds, and we're going to do better than that, but still. And what our kids need is opportunity. Opportunities to have all of the kind of typical literacy experiences that their peers, that their typical siblings, that everyone else is getting. They need opportunities for quality instruction and opportunities to actually practice applying what they know. Something we found at camp, which I think is very typical, is a lot of our kids they're getting taught alphabet stuff in the classroom. Right? Over all their years in school, especially by the time they were teenagers, a lot of them, they knew some sight words. They knew the letters of the alphabet. They had no clue what to do with it. They had been taught how to memorize, how to identify letter K means K. Okay, completely random squiggle. They had learned it. That's great. They couldn't spell a word that starts with K. They couldn't hear a word that started with K and recognize it because that level of instruction hadn't happened. And that we know from the research, this is very common. Students with significant disabilities, often their literacy instruction is restricted to just identifying letters and memorizing sight words. The other thing we were asking at camp is, what is it our parents need? Because the hardest part for me about being a parent of a child with Angelman syndrome is that this all falls on us. Very, very few of us have a school team who can receive our child and go, Angelman syndrome? We know all about that. We've got a plan in place and we're ready to go. Right? We are the ones going to these conferences, collecting this information, going back over and over and over again. So what is it our parents need? And what we saw at camp was very similar. We need lots of these kind of educational experiences. And I've stalked them for 2.5 years trying to like soak as much information out of them as possible and try to bring it back. We need access to real support for how we're going to implement this with our kids. We need other people helping us by making the materials. We need a lot of help with troubleshooting. If we've got a puzzle kid like mine, we hear these great ideas, we try them out, we get no response. We really need help from people who have experience. So that's why we brought these to you. But here's the two major things. So like I said before, access. Our kids need access. They need access to vocabulary. They need access to a whole bunch of things. Access barriers are what they're facing. It's the nature of their disability. Because they can't speak, they don't have oral language, they're not therefore being able to do all those things that kids do when they talk. Because they have fine motor disabilities and gross motor disabilities, they have that barrier. So many of our kids can pick up a book and drop it or flop it around, that kind of stuff, but they don't actually have the fine motor ability to turn pages. Well, then we look at them and go, well, they can't read, right? No, they have a fine motor disability. They can't turn pages. That doesn't mean they actually can't learn how to read. Our kids have access barriers with their motor planning. I'm thinking, and finally I can get my body to do something. Or I'm thinking, I'm going to reach out and touch that, and that hand goes that way, or goes that way. Right? That's called dyspraxia. So that's an access barrier to what they're trying to do. Our kids have some attention deficits. You may have noticed that before. They need their materials to be personally meaningful. They need it to be authentic. There needs to be a reason behind it. Like, who cares about the letter K, right? That two squiggles mean something, unless my name is Katie. Unless my best friend is Kelly, well, now it means something. The number one, well, I guess there's a lot of number one things we can do for our kids, but one of the number one things we can do is make the information that we're providing them, the learning that we're providing them, as personally meaningful as possible, because one of our kids' greatest strengths is how social they are. They so badly, I do not know any group of people who so badly want to interact more deeply with the people around them. And we can help provide that by making their literacy instruction very highly personal. Our kids, many of our kids have a number of vision issues, and some of our kids have some auditory processing where they're just not able to hear and see the information around them in a way that they can act on it. Those are access barriers. These are disabilities that we can create supports, we can build ramps. Just like, oops, I don't know if it'll go back to my little visual. Just like if you have a physical disability and there's a set of stairs in front of you, we can figure out a ramp or an elevator to get you up there. We have these specialists who know how to build ramps for all of the access barriers that our kids face. We know that our kids also, however, face what's called opportunity barriers. That means that kids with significant disabilities, kids who are nonverbal, are spoken to less than kids who speak. We just know that from the research, right? When you don't get that oral response back, it's actually difficult to keep talking, particularly when you talk to your kid and they walk away. Our kids have very few models of anyone reading with them, writing with them, and communicating with them in a way that they can do it the same way. So typical kids watch mom sit down at the table and they watch her pick up a pencil and they come over and they grab a pencil and they make a mark and they're imitating mom. If our kids have too much tactile defensiveness, don't have the fine motor skills to do that, they never actually get that opportunity to do all that early imitation that kids do that actually leads over time to being able to write, that kind of stuff. In particular, they don't have models of communication the way that they can communicate, right? Because we're all talking. We're talking all around them, but we're not talking to them in a language that they can use. And it is really no different than speaking to kids in English and expecting that they're going to learn Spanish on their own and start speaking back to us in Spanish. They have got to have models of language that they can use. And anyone, I'll bet a bunch of you know what aided language stimulation is. Aided language input, where we talk to our kids using a communication system. Anybody? Oh, come on, we've got more than that. Where's the coffee? Who's got a pod book? Okay, look at all these hands. I think the reason why pod has taken off so much with our families is it's highly social. The communication partner is trained to be a good listener, to observe carefully to what the other person is doing and to say, oh, you want that, you're touching that, you're looking at me, you're smiling, oh, I think you like that, you like that. Right? The beauty of POD is the trainings on how to talk to our children in a language that they can actually observe and imitate and try to talk back to us. I can guarantee you that when any baby that you ever brought home as a newborn, you talked to them even though they weren't talking to you back. And you talked to them with the expectation that it was helpful to keep talking to them, even though you might not have heard a word out of them for a year. That's what our kids need, us talking to them with a system. And yet I've spent a lot of time in a lot of our kids' classrooms, and very, very few of our kids have a system where I can say much to them. So I'll go into a classroom, and here's the child's system, and I take a look at it, and I can say, I want goldfish crackers. I want a break. I need the toilet. I don't otherwise have a lot I can say to them with their system. I can't provide them a model of language that they can observe and imitate and try to actually use themselves because their own system doesn't provide that. One of the first things we do is actually train kids' classmates to help provide that modeling, train kids' parents how to provide that modeling. And it's actually not very hard, it's just incredibly awkward and uncomfortable. But if we can get past that, that's actually the hardest part of it. We know that kids with disabilities experience fewer ordinary kid activities. Because face it, our kids are going to therapy, they have doctor's appointments, they might be heat intolerant. There's a whole number of reasons why they don't have the same number of kid opportunities, just normal kid opportunities. Which means that when we talk about things like elephants and tigers and lions, They may have actually not ever been to a zoo and seen them. They may have been to the zoo and couldn't see them, right? Our kids actually need more enriched kid activities than their typical peers, and they actually get less because they're so busy with all of the other kind of ways that we try to respond. So these are called opportunity barriers, and we know that they get significantly less literacy instruction. We spend less time with them reading, probably because we're so sleep deprived and just trying to get them to eat healthy, and they get far fewer repetitions of familiar text. So a typical toddler will manage to get a parent to read the same book to them about 400 times. And we know that if that child has significant disabilities, they'll hear that book most likely less than 10% as often. Because our kids can't say, no, really, again, 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 same one, again, 90 days later, again, right? Asking for the same book over and over the same way that a verbal child can. So these are called opportunity barriers. Opportunity barriers are actually things that we can, it has nothing to do with our kids' disability. This is what we can do different. This is what our teachers can do different, because opportunity barriers are how we are responding to our children and what we're doing different. So what we can do to overcome opportunity barriers is make sure our children have a communication system with a robust vocabulary. Robust vocabulary means you can talk to your child with their system. It means you can argue with your spouse, to some extent, with their system. It means you can scold their siblings with their system, and your siblings can yell at each other with your child's system. If your kids can do if you can do all those things with your child's system, they have an AAC system with a robust vocabulary. We can provide models of talking to our kids and to each other with AAC. And one of the number one things, well, I have to stop saying that because I've got like 100 number one things. But I dare you to go into wherever you guys go, McDonald's, Starbucks, wherever you go, with your child's system and order something to eat. And just experience that. Experience how the other person looks at you. Experience the silence that happens around you as people go. Experience that. And then think about what that must feel like for our kids. Every time all the stars align and they actually manage to reach out and say something with a system, how many times they must actually feel like a freak, being the only person who has to talk with an iPad, the only person who has to talk with a paper book, a PEC symbol. And one of the things we can do for them is make them not alone in that. If we do it too, if we argue with our spouse with it, if we make the honey-do list and nag them with their communication system, then we're making our child not alone. We're surrounding them with a whole community that says, we so value your communication that we're willing to communicate with it too. If we can do that for our kids, then we've really changed things. Something that I'm just so moved by in Maggie's classroom is her teacher this year agreed to have an AAC user of the day. So there's 2 iPads. Maggie brings in 2 iPads, and one of her classmates talks with an iPad all day. And it's not just her friends. And it was really interesting because at first they were like, well, we'll do it for an hour around the literacy block, because they really thought, Maggie's in a grade 6 class, and they really thought, you know, the kids are going to be so silly and so obnoxious. And there had been some really bad experimentation with the foul language that you can program into it. And so they really weren't excited about doing this at first. And you've really got to watch out for Harry in Proloquo. The Proloquo app, Harry does have some really good swear words. And leave kids unsupervised with an AAC system, and they'll also find the bodily sounds you can make, a whole bunch of things. So now I'm totally setting this up wrong, but Maggie's teacher agreed to this year, that there'd be a student for about an hour a day, and now it's a full day. The kids get to wear her system for a full day. They wear it on the same harness that Maggie wears hers on, and they try to talk. And they actually have to take notes about what they couldn't say. And I get these emails from them. You've really got to work on this in her system, because I couldn't say this and I couldn't say that, and they're speaking up in class and going, how am I supposed to be able to do this? How would Maggie ever be able to say this? It's been really, really powerful. So our kids need these models. Maggie, when I first started stalking these 2 over here, I went home and was like, we're going to introduce what's called an alternative pencil. You're going to hear a lot about that to Maggie. We're going to get her writing. And I went home, and Maggie actually started writing. And we've got some amazing writing samples from her where she was scribbling, selecting letters on a whole variety of topics. She'd pick a picture, and she'd type about it. And it was really exciting. And then she stopped about a year ago. And I couldn't figure out why, but she was obsessed with markers and pencils. And literally, she's still like this. About a year ago, she wakes in the morning and finds her markers and pencils. She carries them all around the house all day long and goes to sleep still holding them. And then I finally figured it out. Nobody else is writing the way that she's supposed to write. So once she really understood the concept of writing, she went, I'm a writer, and I'm going to write like them. She's a kid with a fine motor disability. She cannot write very much, although you're going to see her. I'm actually excited by what's happening with her writing. But she cannot write. She cannot express abstract thoughts from her head using a pencil. She does not have the motor skills to do that. And what we have not been able to figure out is creating those models of other people also using keyboards or using some other way of writing. And so that's one of the things, just keep in mind as you see these. We've got to, the more aware our kids become of what this task is, the more that they need to see us willing to do it. And I can guarantee that if I made my weekly shopping list, grocery list, using her alternative pencil, if her sister was writing the same way Maggie's supposed to write, if her best friends were writing the same way, that I think Maggie would be writing that way as well. Our kids need access to instruction, and fortunately, Caroline in particular does workshops all over the country, all over the world. I mean, India, Portugal, wherever, Caroline will come. There's all kinds of workshops we can send them to, and professional development. Our kids need assistive technology, and they just need experience. They just need practice. That's so many things we saw at camp. Another thing we saw at camp was they just didn't have experience writing. They didn't have experience commenting while reading. They were, our kids have, because they don't talk, they've kind of learned that someone reads to them and you're supposed to sit there quietly, and then when they're done, you're done. They hadn't learned, no one had ever showed them that they're supposed to be commenting. They're supposed to be expressing opinions. They're supposed to be saying, boring, read something different, right? And those are the kind of things that we need to be doing for them. Here's just two of our girls. I just thought these were images that captured it. I think I can show you this video really quick. Oh, there's no... Okay, I'm going to skip the audio. This is... I don't know where my mic is. That was just a video of one of Maggie's classmates. She was supposed to construct a sentence using Maggie's system. And so what she said was, I like you, using Maggie's system.
I like you.
The video's not playing. Anyway, we're all laughing.
That's great.
Is it? Oh, good, okay. What we're doing with our kids is we're extending them an invitation. We're saying, we write and we want you to write too. We communicate and we want you to communicate too. We read and we want you to read too. We're also expressing to them our expectation. We're a family of readers, we read together. We're a family of communicators, we communicate to each other. We have this expectation. We need our kids' teachers saying, we have this expectation that you're going to be part of this. So often I go into our kids' classrooms and the teacher says, all right, everyone, we're all going to say this out loud. And there is the kid with Angelman sitting in the corner going, apparently they're not talking to me. And then the teacher says, someone complains that, yeah, she doesn't pay attention. How many instructions do we give kids in a classroom? Either I've seen this in special education classrooms, I've seen this in inclusive classrooms, where we're not actually including our kid with Angelman because they can't actually do what it is we're saying. And what a difference we can make. Imagine, okay, everybody, I need you all to stand up, and you can't. You sit there going, are they noticing that I'm not standing up? Does it matter that I'm not standing up? Apparently it doesn't matter because nobody even notices, right? So when teachers say, I've seen this transform with two kids in particular, where the teachers will say, okay, we're all going to read this out loud. Maisie, Maggie, anybody else, read this with the voice in your head. I'm counting on you, and I want you to nod your head while we read it, so I know you're reading with the voice in your head. Are you with me? Okay, let's get going. And now we're reading it. And we're extending this invitation and this expectation that our child can do it too. Because our kids are learning by about 5 years old that half of what happens in a classroom isn't actually supposed to apply to them. It happens in so many ways. We need to make sure our kids have a really authentic purpose for what we're asking them to do. We are not asking them to memorize random squiggles because we want to be able to be pleased that they've learned the alphabet. We're actually, the authentic purpose is we want them to be able to communicate and interact more deeply with other people. And we really need to emphasize the personal interaction, that's what's powerful about all of this. And everything you're going to see here about literacy today is all about the literacy that develops from the time a baby is born until they start formal schooling. And all of that is based around interaction, because it's the interaction that makes you want to have something to communicate about, to read about, to write about. There's a really interesting study that came about 8 years ago. It was a survey of Angelman parents, and asked Angelman parents what our priorities were for our kids' schooling. And actually no one in the survey, 68 parents completed it, no one in the survey put writing or literacy. And in fact, many of the comments that parents made were that they were worried that those academic goals were actually getting in the way of the things they really cared about. They wanted their children to become more independent, to be able to be more socially interactive, and to communicate more. And so they actually were saying, we wish our schools would do less around literacy, because this is what really matters. And you'll see from this graphic that it's all so combined, right? Listening to other people is a huge part of being able to speak. Reading, taking in someone else's story is a huge part of realizing that you have a story to share that you can tell to other people. It's all completely combined. We can't separate it. There's no prerequisites. You don't have to learn how to listen before you learn how to speak. It's all together. And every time we are working on reading and writing with our kids, we're working on communication, and we're working on social interaction and social closeness. So it's just completely combined. What I'm going to show you here is something called the bridge assessment. You've probably seen it if you've seen any of the other stuff we do. I love it, and I'm going to keep showing it to people until you all use it more, okay? The bridge assessment was designed to assess basically typical or at-risk preschoolers for whether they were ready for literacy instruction. So the bridge asks, how does this student handle or interact with books? Do they explore books? And that includes chewing on them. Do they browse the book pages, kind of flip the pages back and forth? Do they actually sit and hold the book and turn the pages like this, and are they aware of top to bottom? These are the things we're looking for in typical preschoolers. I then surveyed a whole bunch of you on what it is our kids do with literacy, and you'll kind of see this little graph down below. The last bar on the end, I'm sorry you can't read it, the last bar on the end that's fairly high is explores magazines. Our kids disproportionately love magazines. But what you'll see is our kids go all the way through. They love books, they explore books, they flip them around, they chew on them, they try to turn the pages. But then that's where they kind of drop, and you'll see those 2 bars are down below. That's because as much as they love their books, they have an access barrier of the fine motor skills involved in reading. So many of our kids, you'll see that big drop in the graph was because so many of our kids don't have the fine motor skills to turn pages. Fortunately, there's all kinds of things we can do. We can create what's called page fluffers, which I'll show you. We just separate the pages better. We can give them books on a touch screen. They can read books on a computer by just hitting a mouse. They can read board books, laminated books. So many of our kids, if our kids are not interested in books, then the first thing I want to do is find out about their vision. This will not seem intuitive, but if a child has visual impairment, symbols are actually easier to look at than photos. Photos can blur together. And if you look at so many kids' books, they're actually really cluttered. There's these illustrations where things all over, they're actually really hard to look at. If you have visual impairment, you can't make sense of many books. So if you have a child who's not interested in books, then I would want to back off and provide them books that are much more visually simple and see if that makes a difference. We tend to laminate things for our kids with Angelman, but if they actually have a cortical visual impairment, that might be creating a glare every time the light hits the pages, and so all they're seeing is a big white blotch, and they're not actually seeing the pages. They might need more contrast. They might need greater magnification, larger font, right? Big, bold font. And they might have a gross motor disability. They might not be able to independently go to where the books are. In that case, really, one of the most important things we can do is make sure they have the communication skills to take me over there, bring me those, right? That we're working on their communication so that they can control where their body is. Because if they can't move their body somewhere, they need to be able to boss someone else around to move their body to where they need to go. Our kids need lots of books. These are some examples of what page fluffers look like. I mean, lately, I've been just using my glue gun and just making big glued blobs. If you've got old buttons at home, and we had some fun. We had a big pile of old pennies. We just glued the pennies with hot glue to the pages of the books. And what we're doing is creating this gap that makes it a lot easier to turn the page. a really engaging kind of reading for our kids is when they're reading about the things that they have done, right? So this is an example of what's called a remnant book. So notice the pink page shows a tooth. This is about Riley's visit to the dentist. And I just thought it was so interesting. The remnant, the physical object that she chose to represent that was the glove. Well, think about going to the dentist. What's one of the things you most remember, that taste of the glove in your mouth, right? We can make them books with photos of their own life. We can download books from a site called Tar Heel Reader. If you're in a Facebook group called Angelman Literacy in Education, we talk about Tar Heel Reader all the time. Notice how visually simple these books are. We can make sure that we're providing them the books about things that really, really matter. So M is for me and H is for Harry. Harry Styles. If you don't know who he is, you just don't have a 12-year-old daughter. We can provide, Maggie's been really interested in books because she uses the symbol system, Symbol Sticks. She's actually really enjoyed a lot of the books from what's called the unique curriculum, which a whole bunch of school boards have access to. She likes seeing her symbols in her books. She likes having them as part of the illustration. The bridge asks, how does a student interact with symbols and print? And what you'll see here, the first bars that are so high, asks, does your child enjoy listening to stories? Most of our kids do. Do they enjoy when we sing songs? Yes, we had almost 100% response rate that our kids enjoy being sung to. And then watch what happens to those bars. Well, here's what we're asking in those questions. Are they starting to recognize print? Do they know that the letters on the page are representing the words that we speak? And when we're reading a book, that we're actually reading those words. Do they understand that? Do they know where to read on a page? Do they know that we read the words and not the pictures? Because understand that our kids have a communication disability, and so they have been presented with photos and symbols their entire life. It's very likely that they think the meaning is in the pictures and the symbols and not in the words, right? So we have to actually build that ramp to help them understand that. We often don't know if our kids understand about the concept of words because they don't have oral language to tell us about it. They might not have the fine motor abilities to point to the page to show where they're supposed to read. They might not have the vision to be able to access these materials, but one thing we can do is really provide them with a communication system. That same communication system we can talk to our other kids about, that we can scold our husbands about, that's the one that our kids need, and lots of experience. Here are some examples of our kids using communication systems. Any of your kids know this symbol? If they do, then your kid can learn symbols. And if your kids are like mine, they might not actually know that one, but they might know this one. That's just the kind of mother they have. If they can learn that, then they can learn symbols. The reason kids learn symbols like that one, because they see it everywhere. Everybody uses it. It's incredibly important because it results in something I really love. See? We have to get their other symbols to be as pervasive as that, surrounding our kids and all their other symbols, and make sure that all their other symbols are associated with the things that they enjoy as much as that one. And you might not have a McDonald's kid, but I bet you can think of the logo that your kid absolutely knows. I don't think I'm going to have time to show this video really quick, but one thing we do is we make digital books for a bunch of our kids. You'll find so many of our kids. Anybody have a kid who's really into video? Just a major video kid, see? So interestingly, if you have cortical visual impairment, you can more easily attend to something that's moving than something that's still. And one of the patterns I see in our kids with some vision issues is really being driven by video, trying to find video wherever they can get it. Well, take a look at your kid and ask yourself, do they only notice things? Do they seem to only really notice things when they're moving? When you want them to look at something, do you tend to move it to get their attention? Well, if so, they might very well have cortical visual impairment, and we might need to provide them books that move. And this is actually an example of a video book made by a second grade classmate of one of Stacy's kids. And it's absolutely adorable, and I wish I had time to show it to you, and I will show it to you after the session, if anybody wants to see it. Oh, make it keep going. When we talk about robust communication systems, these are just some screenshots from two different kids' Proloquo systems. But notice this is what I mean by core words you can say. If I look at the one on, let's see, your left, I'm still learning my left and right, but I'm hoping to master it by the time I'm 50, since I didn't learn it by the time I was 40. I've got stop. No, not. Different. I'm finished, more, come, come here, go, go there, right? These are called core words. These are words that a kid can use the home page of their communication system to tell you to read this some more, or to stop reading, or to read something different, right? Notice that you can use this to scold your pets as well as your children, because you can say, stop, no, go, right? These are really high frequency words. These are words we use with everybody all across the school day. And when we're talking about robust communication systems, this is one example of what those kind of robust communication systems look like. Don't worry about the fact that your child could not possibly use that right now on their own. Because when your child came home from the hospital at 1 day old, you spoke to them using a whole bunch of words that they could not possibly speak back to you. And you did that for the whole first year, right? We have all done that. We have all spoken to someone who has not talked back to us. And we've done it without expecting a response back. And that's what we have to do using our kids' systems. This is another video book. I'm not going to show it, but Maggie's been learning sight words. She's actually typed some of her sight words. One of her words is and. Nobody cares about and, right? I could not figure out for the life of me why it's one of the first sight words kids learn. Well, guess what and does? And brings you together with the people you care the most about. Because it's Maggie and Sarah. It's Harry and Liam and Niall, right? I mean, we would have no One Direction without the word and. How powerful is that, right? So as we've kind of stepped back and gone, well, why would Maggie care about and? Well, I know why she would care about and. Then we've been able to make materials for Maggie and start teaching her sight words. We ask in the bridge, how does the child engage in the act of reading? Are they aware someone's reading to them? Overwhelmingly, our kids are. Do they enjoy being read to? That's where we already see a drop. That's that second column. That third column is, does not attend when I read stories. So a good chunk of us, about a quarter of us, have kids where we have sat down and we have tried to read to them. And chances are we're either not reading something interesting enough, which could very well be, or our kids are really struggling to take in all of that information from us. They're supposed to look at something, at the same time they're supposed to listen to us, at the same time they're supposed to have some kind of interaction, and that's just not working for them. And that's where we already start to run into some of these barriers. In a further question, I'll get into the rest just because I'm already running out of time. Our kids have access barriers there around vision and auditory processing. If they're not attending during storybook reading, we need to make sure that they can really see the books and that the books make sense to them and that they're not too visually complex. They have opportunity barriers because I don't know if you noticed, but by the third step, in this area of the bridge, we're asking if the child is pointing to pages. Yes, our kids do. Labeling items on the page. Yes, they do. Are they commenting? Are they starting to act out? Those things all develop together. And yet, I've been in classrooms with 15-year-olds where they're still being expected to identify and point to things on the page, and they're never being asked to comment back. Right? So our kids aren't actually getting the opportunity to do anything more interesting with a book than please someone else by pointing to what they're being told to point at. And then we're surprised that they don't like books, right? So that's just one of the things that we need to be working on. We can put books in their communication system. So this is, I know from our survey of Angelman families that like 140 of us own the app Go Talk Now. It is a great app for storybooks. We can throw the storybooks in and they have to touch the words to hear the page be read back to them. We provide, so this is one of Caroline's interactive reading displays. You can download it for free from her website. And when we're reading to our kids, we can say, I'm going to turn the page. Do you want me to act it out? It's a dog. Does that mean I have to bark? And now we bark while we act out the book, right? You're laughing. Did you think that was cool? But do you see how we can touch those symbols and now provide a model of how to interact using symbols while we're reading together? Here is a more elaborate version of one of those for when we just start needing more words. And what you'll find is the more that you try to talk to your child with the system you want them to use, the more you're going to go, we need some more words. Because we run out pretty quickly of what we can say with very few words. And all of these are shared freely in that Facebook education group. And I know you're all in the Gala group, therefore I know you're all on Facebook. We can make them alphabet books about the things they really care about. And for our kids, that tends to be food and people are the two of the first things that we make alphabet books for them about. We look at what our kids are doing with writing. So how does our child write and draw with pencils? Are they exploring them? That includes chewing them. Yes, our kids tend to be exploring them. This first column is does not write or draw. So these are the kids most likely who have so much tactile defensiveness that they're not willing to pick up something. So a third of our kids aren't even starting with writing and drawing. But about 2/3 of our kids are picking up pens and markers and crayons, anything they can get their hands on, Sharpies on our white couches, and making as many marks as they can possibly make. But then we start to see this huge drop-off where their writing doesn't develop the way that it does with their peers, where we can't tell if their writing is any different from their drawing. Right? Because with their typical peers, you start seeing the separation, but our kids, again, have an access barrier. They don't have the fine motor skills to be able to draw something that looks different from their letters, and so we have to scaffold that for them. And Gretchen will be talking about what's called an alternative pencil. When I say scaffold, I mean like build them a ramp. We're building them a ramp so they can do this. Now, some of our kids can. It's more typical for our kids to draw just the kind of lines that we see on this page, often because our kids don't like to grasp things. But some of our kids, like our rock star Emma, clearly is representing meaning. She is telling stories with her drawings. And I would desperately love to hear what she's actually trying to tell a story about. And that would be my major communication goal for her, is to be able to share this, because she goes day after day drawing these kinds of pictures, but we don't know what she's drawing. So then I asked, okay, well, so typical kids, you know, the way the bridge is, it's asking how are kids writing? Well, how do our kids write when they have a keyboard? The first thing, because that's kind of a substitute, right? If you can't form a letter with the pencil, then you can do it with a keyboard. That first column is does not write, does not type on a keyboard at all. So half of our kids aren't even being put in front of a keyboard. Or if they are, we're going, no, don't mess up my computer, right? So we have to figure out how we're going to put what we call an alternative pencil in front of our kids. That second column is that they type random characters. And the third column is they type long strings of letters. That's all developmentally appropriate exploration of the alphabet. And then you'll see a major drop-off. And that's where Gretchen will get into. So this is what developmentally appropriate exploration with a keyboard looks like. This is the first thing we expect kids to do once they figure out what a keyboard is for. So we asked, okay, well, how often does your person write with an alphabet? 2/3 said never. Our kids are not being provided with the full alphabet, such as a keyboard, to write about anything. Well, this explains why they can all come to a literacy camp and not have any experience writing, right? If 2/3 of our kids aren't, you'll notice that fewer than 10% are getting writing built into their daily school day. Some of our kids, though, are learning to write. I don't know where Teresa is. If this was written with an alphabet flip chart or a letterboard. Letterboard. So she's pointing to letters arranged on a letterboard. I have 100 copies of a letterboard, and everyone who sat in the front row will be physically closest to them, so they can have them at the end of the session. But you guys in the back can try to beat the other ones forward to get them. So what Emma's doing is she's pointing to letters on a letterboard, arranged most likely in an alphabetic order. Okay, and she's selecting pictures about what she's going to write about, and then is she using her Nova chat to say what she's written about? That's what we're working on next. So here she has chosen pictures of her and her friend Anna going to a game, and look at the letters that she has selected as she's written about going to a game with her friend Anna. We see the initial sounds of the word watch. We see the primary sounds we hear in the name Anna, and we see the G's we would expect in the word game. This is how writing develops in typical kids, and this is what happens with our kids when they're really invited to use an alphabet. This is another drawing of Emma's from when she was in church. And I just think this is so powerful. I wish all of our kids had this level of fine motor ability and this sensitive of a parent. The minister was talking about having basically our earthly family and our heavenly Father overseeing us. Emma's part of a family of 3. Look what she was able to represent. We have no reason to think that every single one of our children doesn't have that in their head, but doesn't have the fine motor skills to be able to demonstrate it. And when we talk about writing, we're trying to make sure that we're providing a way for them to express these kind of ideas. These are just more writing examples from our kids. And when you hear from Sadie's team next, Sadie's little girl in Ontario, you'll see, will you see some of her writing samples? Yes, you'll see some of her writing samples. Because that's why we love them so much. They were This is a school team that has taken writing to a new level. So, but what we're trying to do with our kids is really help them with their access barriers and providing access to language, and Gretchen will talk more about this. We asked, how does your child write their name? For so many of our kids, you'll see those little columns at the far end, they're using stamps. Well, 2 years ago, I stalked these two, and I heard that Maggie was supposed to be writing her name on her own, and that we should provide her a model after that. But of course, she's got a fine motor disability. I couldn't imagine how she would do that. After 2 years of writing, that first squiggle is Maggie's M. It's taken her 2 years of every time she has an assignment, which is all across the school day, being asked, now write your name, Maggie. That's what she's writing now. It's not what she wrote 2 years ago. At first, she was like, what are you talking about? And then her aide says, that's how you write your name. Here's how I write your name, and writes it after. And with that level of repetition, she can now do her first letter. Now, this is a kid with a profound fine motor disability who used to hate grasping things, but she's actually excited to use her pencil to sign her name. Because what's more important than that, I was greeted at the airport by one of those greeters with a sign with my name, and it went all over, I put it all over Facebook. I was so excited because we really care about names. Names matter. And there was another sign in the window of the vehicle, so I had my name twice. We care about names. Names matter. Names are the first words that kids learn how to read, right? The more we do with their names, the more we bring them into their names, the better. We asked how our kids are exploring alphabet materials. I don't have time to show you. This is hilarious. But we make books for our kids where we're really drawing attention to names. I'll put this example of a book. Jay and Retta both recorded pages in this book for Brooklyn, and it's hilarious. And Jay's got a little bit of toilet humor, but I'm going to skip that just because we're running out of time so much. I asked, what do our kids understand in terms of the sounds of language? Remember what I said before, that, that ability to know that Maggie, Maisie, Mama start with the same sound, that Maggie, Maisie, Mama start with the letter M. That's the kind of knowledge that when you know that, you can actually start applying it, because now I'm thinking of McDonald's, and I know it sounds like Maisie and Maggie, so it must start with an M. And that's how kids learn how to become problem solvers and actually start typing in a way that someone else can understand what they're doing. There's a whole bunch of activities that Caroline will show you about how we develop this awareness in our kids. But when we ask our families, what do our kids show us that they understand about how those sounds of language work, this is the response we get. Because our kids aren't talking, so they can't show us what they know. But fortunately, we've got Caroline to show us how we can develop these same understandings so that they can develop the same kind of skills. And I promise, Becky, I'm almost done. 1 minute, okay. I might be slightly over, but hardly by anything. This is amazing. This is my kid who, if we read to her, she left the room. She is now, after 2 years of literacy instruction, and with bringing Caroline to Ontario probably 6 times, 7 times in 2 years?
I think every other month.
About every other month. With that level of literacy interaction, Maggie's now able to, now this doesn't happen every day because Maggie's one of our puzzles. This is when all the stars align. She has been able to use her communication system to respond to grade level texts. So here's a chapter book being read in her class called Everest, where these kids, I guess, get to climb Mount Everest. Here's the assignment that the rest of the kids had to do to basically summarize 2 chapters, and what they did with Maggie was just read selected paragraphs. The teacher selected what she thought were particularly powerful paragraphs that really talked about the emotions of a character, and asked Maggie to use her communication system. What words would you choose to describe this character? And these are the words that she selected. She was totally on target for 2 and wildly guessing and random on the middle one. But in the middle, right after she answered the first one, so she said, curious, relaxed, good, using her feelings category. That's how she summarized the feelings of this character. She then said, time, say, think. 3 symbols that she put together. Time, say, think. And her aide said, are you asking for a break? And she was like, oh. That was as much as she could do. And lastly, we asked, how does your person engage in storytelling? Because by the time a kid goes into school and starts conventional literacy instruction, they understand that they have a story to share with the world. The world wants to hear their stories, and they're starting to tell stories back. That's our response. That last column is, my child does not appear to engage in any form of storytelling, right? Now, this is obvious. We know this. Our kids don't talk. They can't tell stories, right? No. We can figure out the technology, we can figure out the communication systems to give them words, and we can figure out the support such as the remnant books we showed earlier, such as the Pictello stories so many of our kids use. What Carolyn does whole workshops on what's called social scripts. We can put stories into our kids' hands, because I think one of the most important things our kids need to learn is that we desperately want to hear their stories. The world needs to hear their stories, we want to hear their stories, and we are going to provide them the support so they can tell us their stories. So that's it.